Felix sat on the rickety wooden bench outside his mud house, staring at the plot of land his late father had left him. It wasn't much, just a patch of earth that seemed to produce more weeds than crops. His stomach growled in protest as he thought about the single yam he had boiled for lunch. "Ah, what use is this land?" Felix muttered to himself, scratching his head. "I could plant more yams, but how long would that take? And even then, yams won't make me rich." He sighed deeply, looking at the setting sun. Then, as if struck by a lightning bolt of brilliance, an idea came to him. "I've got it," he exclaimed, jumping up so quickly that the bench nearly tipped over. "If I sell the land and use the money wisely, I can build a great future. I will marry many wives and have an army of children. Surely, out of 90 or 100 children, one of them will become rich and rescue me from this miserable life." The thought seemed foolproof to Felix. After all, wasn't wealth just a matter of numbers? More wives meant more children, and more children meant a greater chance at success. It was simple math, really. Without wasting any time, Felix put his plan into motion. He sold the land for a decent sum and used part of the money to renovate his house, adding a few extra rooms. The rest he spent on courting wives from near and far. Felix's charm, though fueled more by desperation than natural charisma, worked wonders. Before long he had 10 wives. Each woman brought her unique personality into the mix. Wife number 1 was the no-nonsense type who ran the household like a military camp. Wife number 2 was the soft-spoken dreamer who sang lullabies even when there were no babies. Wife number 3 loved to cook, though her meals were so spicy they often brought tears to everyone's eyes. Wife number 4 loved to complain. About everything. All the time. Wife number 5. Well, she was just there for the drama. The rest had equally distinct quirks, but Felix didn't mind. His focus was on the children they would bring into the world. And bring them they did. In just a few short years, Felix's home was overrun with 90 children of all ages, sizes, and temperaments. The house buzzed with activity, from the sound of toddlers wailing to older kids shouting about missing sandals. Initially, Felix felt like a king. He sat proudly in the middle of his noisy household, imagining how his sons would one day become doctors, traders, and even chiefs. But soon cracks began to show. The children, as they grew older, formed alliances based on their mothers. Each group claimed to be superior to the others, which led to daily squabbles. "Your mother burned the stew yesterday." "Well, at least my mother doesn't snore like a buffalo." Felix tried to mediate at first, but the quarrels grew too frequent and too petty. And the wives? Oh, the wives were no better. They bickered over everything: who cooked better, who had more beautiful children, and even who Felix smiled at more during breakfast. One fateful morning, Felix sat in the corner of the house, surrounded by the chaos he had created. The air was thick with shouting, pots clanging, and babies crying. "This is not what I planned," he groaned, burying his face in his hands. His dream of a united, prosperous family had turned into a nightmare. Every time he tried to assert his authority, the children would either ignore him or gang up on him. "Papa, you only care about wife number 3's children." "That's a lie. He clearly favors wife number 6's children." Felix felt like a referee in a never-ending wrestling match, but with no whistle and no rules. One day, Felix's eldest son, a tall and lanky boy with a knack for stirring trouble, had an idea. He gathered all his siblings and said, "Why should we keep fighting among ourselves? Let's focus on the real issue here, Papa." The children, united for the first time, nodded in agreement. They decided to hold a family meeting and confront Felix about his failure as a father. When Felix heard about the meeting, he laughed nervously. "Ah, children. What do they know? I am their father. They should respect me." But respect was the last thing on their minds. During the family meeting, Felix sat in the middle of the room while his 90 children surrounded him like a jury ready to deliver a verdict. "Papa," the eldest began, "we've had enough of your bad leadership. You sold our inheritance, married too many wives, and now look at this chaos." Felix tried to defend himself, but the children were relentless. One by one they listed his mistakes, each more embarrassing than the last. By the end of the meeting, Felix was speechless. His own children had turned against him, and his wives had sided with their respective camps. As the years went by, Felix's house became increasingly divided. Some of his children left to start their own lives, while others stayed to continue the chaos. Felix found himself isolated. No one came to him for advice or comfort. His grand plan had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but regrets. One evening, as he sat alone on the same rickety bench where his grand plan had been born, he muttered to himself, "Maybe I should have just planted yams." Felix's life continued in solitude. His children came to visit occasionally, but only to argue over trivial matters or complain about their mothers. Even his 10 wives rarely sought his company. One day, as he sat outside his house, staring at the barren ground where his land used to be, a young boy approached him. The boy, one of Felix's younger sons, carried a small basket of fruits. "Papa, I brought these for you," the boy said shyly. Felix's eyes widened. It had been years since any of his children had shown him kindness. "Why are you here, my son?" Felix asked, his voice trembling. "Because you're my father, and I don't like seeing you sad," the boy replied. For the first time in years, Felix smiled. The boy, named Ben, was different from his siblings. He wasn't interested in the constant fighting or the alliances his brothers and sisters formed. Instead, he spent his time reading old books he had borrowed and observing the world around him. "Papa," Ben began one evening, "why don't you do something with this land again?" Felix chuckled bitterly. "What land? I sold it all." "But you still have this yard," Ben said, pointing to the small patch of dirt in front of the house. Felix shook his head. "What can I do with such a tiny space?" Ben's eyes sparkled with determination. "We can plant something. I've read about crops that don't need much land. If we work together, we can grow enough to sell at the market." Reluctantly, Felix agreed to Ben's plan. Using some old tools, they dug up the ground and planted seeds that Ben had gathered. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the weeks passed, the first green shoots began to appear. Felix watched in amazement as the barren patch transformed into a vibrant garden. The other children noticed the change and, out of curiosity, began to help. One by one they joined Felix and Ben in tending the garden. Even the wives stopped arguing long enough to admire the growing crops. The harvest was small but successful. Ben convinced Felix to sell the produce at the market, and the little they earned was reinvested into buying more seeds and tools. Word spread about Felix's garden, and neighbors began to offer advice and support. For the first time in years, Felix felt a sense of purpose. As the garden expanded, so did the cooperation within the family. The children who once fought over everything now worked side by side, digging, planting, and watering. Even the wives found ways to contribute without bickering. Felix marveled at the transformation. "This is what I dreamed of," he whispered to himself one evening. "A family working together." One day, as Felix and Ben sat under a tree, Felix turned to his son and said, "You know, my boy, I've learned something important." "What's that, Papa?" Ben asked. Felix smiled. "Wealth isn't about how many children you have or how much land you own. It's about what you do with what you have. And it's about family, not just numbers." Ben grinned. "Does that mean you're going to stop blaming the yams?" Felix laughed heartily for the first time in years. "Yes, my boy. I'll stop blaming the yams." Over the years, Felix's small garden grew into a thriving farm. The family, once divided, became a close-knit unit. Felix's story of foolish ambition and eventual redemption became a legend among the villagers. Felix, now old and gray, sat on the same bench where his grand plan had been born. This time he was surrounded by his children and grandchildren, all laughing and sharing stories. "Papa," one of his grandchildren asked, "is it true you once sold all your land to marry 10 wives?" Felix chuckled. "Ah, my dear, it's true. But let me tell you something. The best thing I ever grew wasn't crops. It was this family." The family cheered and Felix smiled, content at last. As Felix's small farm flourished, opportunities began to knock on his door. A local merchant who visited the market was impressed by the quality of the vegetables Felix and his family sold. "This is good produce, old man," the merchant said one day. "What if I buy everything you grow and sell it in other villages? I'll pay you a fair price." Felix hesitated. He had never trusted merchants much, but Ben, who had been quietly listening, nudged him. "Papa, this could be our chance to grow even more," Ben whispered. After some negotiation, and a lot of haggling from Felix, the deal was sealed. The merchant began buying their crops in bulk, and Felix reinvested the earnings to expand the farm. The once chaotic household turned into a well-oiled machine. Each child had a role in the family business. Some were in charge of planting and harvesting. Others handled the logistics of packing and transporting the goods. A few of the older ones, surprisingly business-minded, worked on keeping track of profits and expenses. Even the wives found their place, forming a committee to oversee the meals for the growing workforce. Felix watched in amazement as his dream of a successful family began to come true, not because of luck but because of hard work and unity. News of Felix's thriving farm spread far and wide. People marveled at how a man who had once squandered everything had managed to rebuild his life. Villagers came to him for advice, and Felix, ever the storyteller, was happy to share his wisdom. "I'll tell you the secret," Felix would say, leaning in dramatically. "It's not about how many children you have. It's about raising them right. And never ever underestimate the power of yams." The villagers would laugh, but they knew there was truth in his words. One fateful year, disaster struck. A severe drought swept through the region, threatening to destroy Felix's crops. The family, now tightly knit, refused to give up. "We can survive this," Ben said confidently. "We faced worse." Together, they dug trenches to conserve water, built makeshift irrigation systems, and worked tirelessly to save what they could. Though the harvest was smaller that year, the family managed to pull through, thanks to their resilience and teamwork. Felix, who had once been a man of grand but flawed ideas, now felt immense pride in his family's strength and determination. Years passed and Felix grew older. The once lively man now spent most of his time sitting under the shade of the big tree in his yard, watching his grandchildren play. One day Ben, now a grown man, sat beside him. "Papa," Ben said, "you've taught us so much. Do you ever regret selling the land?" Felix smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Regret? Of course. I was a foolish man back then. But if I hadn't made those mistakes, I wouldn't have learned what truly matters. And I wouldn't have had you, my boy." Ben placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We're proud of you, Papa. You turned things around and gave us a life to be thankful for." Felix chuckled softly. "Well, I had a lot of help. You saved me, Ben. You and your siblings. I'm the luckiest man alive." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the farm, Felix closed his eyes and sighed deeply. His journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had led him to a place of peace and fulfillment. After Felix passed away peacefully years later, his children and grandchildren continued to run the farm, keeping his memory alive. They often told the tale of how their father's grand plan had nearly ruined them but had ultimately brought them closer together. The farm became a symbol of resilience and unity, and Felix's story was shared across generations as a lesson in humility, perseverance, and the power of family. And so, Felix's legacy endured, not in the land he had sold or the chaos he had created, but in the love and laughter that now thrived where despair once reigned.